Welcome to the eighth episode of the In Between Classes podcast. I am your host, Will Golub, joined like always by my friend Josh Schmidt. Josh, how's it going?
It's been a fun week. It's been Teacher Appreciation Week, so it's been a lot of fun to see the kids excited. But I think congratulations are in order. You moved this week.
Yes, I did. I guess more congratulations for the graduation I had on Saturday. But yes, moved this week to White Lake, South Dakota, where I will be beginning my first teaching job next fall. So yes, it's kind of living out of boxes right now. Don't need to go too in depth on that, but yes, it's been a busy weekend and busy week for me.
Well, I'm excited to talk about one of the huge projects that you did in college. And so, without spoiling too much, describe to us what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so today we thought it'd be fun to do something a little bit different with this episode. Instead of picking a very specific topic and breaking it up into three smaller topics, what we did is we actually wanted to talk about, it was my senior research project that I did that is obviously very related to pretty much what this whole podcast is about. And we figured it was pretty timely. I did my capstone defense last fall, and then earlier this spring I was scheduled to present this at NCUR in Atlanta. Unfortunately, because of the giant blizzard we got in the middle of April, welcome South Dakota, we weren't unable to go, so that was really disappointing. But when that happened, we thought, this would be a great idea for a podcast episode. So essentially what it is I did my senior research project on paced classrooms, and I wanted to go in and find the advantages and disadvantages of them, particularly in math classroom, because obviously that's my major. So before I start going into that, I know we've talked about this kind of classroom extensively, but Josh, I'll give you about a minute and a half here to just give a quick overview of what a paced classroom is, as obviously I got the idea for doing this research from you. So I know it's very complex, but in a quick summary, what can you say about a paced classroom, or your paced classroom specifically?
So with my classroom, the biggest goal is the idea that kids learn at different speeds in different time frames and in different ways. So when we create a topic, we try to create different learning opportunities within that topic that the kids can progress through at their own speed. Might be video, might be computer-based, might be textbook, might be worksheet, might be project, whatever. But the belief is that they can learn at their own speed and their own time frames within reason. Obviously, kids not going to sit on the same topic from August until January. The second component, which is a little bit different than some of the other classrooms you looked at, is I involve a lot of choice and a lot of leveling within those metrics. But the focus of this presentation and Will's research was mostly focused on the pacing element, and is pacing a beneficial concept in math classrooms? Because, Will, if I remember correctly, there's not much data on this at all.
Yeah, and that's one of the tough things about this research is I went in and I did, a big literature review. That's pretty much before any research that a person does, you should go out and find out, okay, have other people done research on this? And I pretty much found out that there's absolutely no research on paced classrooms specifically. Some things I did find out about is self-regulated learners, which I, tied in as very related, because in a paced classroom, you need to be a self-regulated learner. Like you said, if you have an unself-regulated, unmotivated student, they could sit on a topic from August to January. So I think the idea about a paced classroom is if you're a self-regulated learner, you can be very successful. Or on the flip side, you can learn self-regulated learning skills by being in a paced classroom, because it's basically, swim or drown. You have to learn those skills or else you won't survive in that type of a classroom. Or at least, have you found that to be the case in your classrooms? Do students learn self-regulated learning skills?
Oh, yeah, and that's not just because of the pacing environment. And I think that's one thing I hope people don't misinterpret is I'm not saying that you need pacing in order to gain those skills. But I will say that if you include some type of pacing in your environment, you can create really independent, self-sufficient learners. And just simple things like You don't know how to do this problem? Well, what resources have you tried? Who have you talked to? Things like that are really, really beneficial, and you can't emulate that any other way. There's nothing the same as, okay, so I'm working on section S5, and no one in the room is working on S5. What do I do? And that's an amazing beneficial opportunity for kids that you really can't get anywhere else. And Will, in this research, didn't you interview, because I know you worked with me pretty closely, who are the other teachers that you worked with on this?
Yeah, so obviously, I guess when you start research, like I said, I did the literature review, and then I created, a kind of map of my methodology, how I wanted to go about finding out, information on this. And the first thing I did was I started with teacher interviews, which basically I just found 3 different educators that teach in, I guess, what fell under my definition of a self-paced classroom. And like I said, obviously you were my main go-to when I started preparing for this. So I interviewed you multiple times. It was last spring, I believe, when I was starting this. So yeah, obviously started with you then. And you were working in a middle school math classroom and still are, but then I wanted to find 2 other teachers that taught this same way in a similar process. And what I ended up finding was there was another teacher, Mr. Bowman, who is a high school math teacher in Belle South Dakota. It's about 10 miles away from Spearfish. It, obviously just proximity made it easier for me to get a hold of him and pick his brain on his classroom. And then the next one I interviewed was, her name is Professor Jill Trimble at Black Hills State University, where I did my research. She does a lot of the remedial math, mostly, college algebra 095. Basically, students have to take pre-college algebra before doing actual college algebra. She teaches a lot of those students, and she has mostly focused on flipped classrooms, but she does allow pacing elements in her classroom. So those were the 3 main teachers that I talked to, and excuse me. And during those interviews, it mostly just focused on, first off, their classroom setup, why it is that we could define their classroom as a self-paced classroom. And obviously, Josh, you just talked about yours. Yours obviously very much falls into that setting. The other 2 obviously run theirs a little bit different. They certainly don't have the leveling or choice elements, but it still does have those pacing methods. Now, one that I found interesting is Professor Trimble. She does a minimum pace where basically you have to be so far by this day. If you're not, then you just get zeros on everything prior to that. So you can't fall behind, but you can move ahead as you like. And Josh, that's something I kind of want to ask you about. Have you ever considered a minimum pace, or is that something that obviously the idea is this to allow students to move faster, slower if need be? What are your thoughts on minimum pace?
The longer I've done it, I feel like a minimum pace is necessary at least to have as a conversation starter. I have lots of students who are able to work behind the minimum pace, but there's a trade of some kind that's involved in that process. So I'm not going to take away a vast majority of points for being behind, but there is a conversation that happens like, are you behind because you need extra practice? Or are you behind because you just decided to not work for yesterday? And I think especially when you're dealing with younger kids, making sure that there are logical consequences for not doing your work in a timely fashion is vital. And whatever you want to call that, like a minimum speed. I have a calendar in the back of the room and kids develop their own calendar, but there's something that tells them generally where I want them to be. We also include like other components besides just raw pacing that can be really valuable. And that's something that I would expect there to be different in a high school classroom and a college classroom. Middle school is very much using pacing to help us do other things. So, like we're going to move quickly through this content so we can do a project, or we're going to work through this content at a wide variety of times so that we can do little activities during the day. And for us, that's been a big, big advantage. What are some things that you heard from teachers that were drastically different, like because it was middle school versus high school versus college?
Well, that was kind of the first thing. So when I mentioned or was talking to Professor Trimble and she said she had that strict minimum due date, I immediately thought to myself, oh, that makes sense. These are college students. They have to be more responsible. Yeah, if you can't get something done by a deadline, there should be consequences. And I flat out said to her, like, is that a product of being, okay, this is college. There are minimum due dates in life. Let's start hitting you with them now, as opposed to a middle school and high school classroom. You can be a little bit more flexible. So that was the first major thing that I caught from her. But surprisingly, she came back and said, no, it's not because I'm trying to be tougher on them and teach them, like, okay, there are strict minimum due dates in life. You better get it done now. She flat just said, I feel like it helps the kids. Like, they know, okay, I got to get it. It's a motivator. Be like, there's a strict deadline. I got to get it done by that strict deadline. And it's a motivating tool rather than, I guess, that getting that strict deadline type thing. But that was one thing. The next thing is we kind of talked about the flexibility from teaching styles, and you just said it yourself. You can play with your pacing so that the students can fit in another project or something like this or something like that, as opposed to the flexibility for the college students. The teacher flat out says, if you finish this class, it's supposed to run from August to December. If you finish at the beginning of November, you're done. You don't need to show up anymore. So then that was a big motivating factor for a lot of students in colleges. I create this flexibility so that I get to have more time back for myself, as opposed to in your classroom, that flexibility is used so we can do more fun and games type, not games, but kind of games. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times it is games. Actually, I think that's the best part. I do have a quick question on that though. I want to hear what you have to think on this before I kind of pitch in on my own. So the college teacher is doing what I guess I've called like an online class in person. Like it's the idea that when you take an online class and you're doing, like comment boards online and, read to other people's comments and watch, 18 videos, like that can get really draining to do that consistently. But this teacher has an in-class component. What do you feel like the benefits are from having that in-class component rather than just putting all of her content online and letting kids work through it at their own speed that way?
Obviously, the biggest advantage to that is she flat out says, I'm there in the classroom to help the students. I mean, she in a perfect world, she basically tells her students, you can move ahead if you like, but, this stuff is set out on a certain pace so you can walk through it a bit at a time. So in perfect world, she'd say, watch the videos at night, come to class the next day and talk to me about your questions on the assignment. Finish the assignment up in class. Watch the next video at night, come talk to me, ask questions in class, finish up the next assignment. So yes, as in a traditional online classroom, it is just that. It's, the teacher has everything set up online and you never actually speak with the teacher once, as opposed to this sort of online in-person setting. She can work with the students. They can ask her questions on a daily basis as much as they'd like or as much as she'd like. So that's a very helpful component that I really like about it. Like I said, it's kind of merging the best of both worlds, the convenience of online classroom while with the face-to-face service of an in-class classroom.
I love the way you phrase that too, because I have this issue. If someone walks into my classroom on a pacing-focused day, sometimes it looks like I'm not doing a whole bunch, and they'll be like, wow, so you just put the videos online and they just work through it. And I'm like, hold up. Like we have worked on this for years to get these kids to the point where they can be independent for a day or two. And I said, like, they're not on an island here. Like, I'd love to help them. And I feel great that we've given them enough resources that they don't need me immediately. I do have classes that need me all the time. Like, we're still getting there. But I feel like this type of setup is so effective at helping kids, like, prepare for the next step of their life. It's so good to help kids prepare for high school, prepare for college, or prepare for the workforce, because so many of these skills are directly transferable to being a successful human being. And I do feel like it's a better version of an online classroom because it's created by the teacher that's there. You have someone to ask all the time, and you can use pacing as a benefit to do other stuff. Like, it's not just like work through it faster just for working through it faster. Like, If you want to be done with your college class early, that's great. If you want to, not go to class on a Friday in college, that's great. If you want to do a cool game or a project in middle school, that's great too. But it's just this type of classroom is an avenue for other really cool things.
Right. And especially what you mentioned there, I think that segues nicely into the next portion of it that talks about, so like I said, my first point of research was interviewing teachers. The next point of the research was surveying the students. And in those 3 classrooms that I mentioned, I got permission from all the teachers and I distributed a survey to all their students. I think it came up to around about 35-ish students in each classroom. So I got over 100 points of data from different students. And this survey is, I think we could spend a little bit of time on this just because it is it's very in depth. So essentially what I did with this survey was I asked I put down 20 statements on the survey, and the students had to rank how much they agree with those statements on a range from strongly disagree, kind of disagree, neither agree nor disagree, kind of agree, strongly agree. So again, it's a range with, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And within there, the students basically just had to mark how much they agree with the given statement. And so, for example, the first statement on the survey was, I find it difficult to do my schoolwork for my self-paced class because I don't always have access to internet. That's a very straightforward question asking students, okay, is this inconvenient for you because you go home and you might not have internet at home? And that's actually something I realized with one of my students during my student teaching, because I was in a self-paced class. There was one girl, the teacher flat out told me she doesn't have internet at home. And when she was in class, I know she was always the most on task, just blocked out everybody else in the classroom because she knew that, okay, I'm at a disadvantage. I can't work on this at home. I got to get it done here in school. But that's just one example of one of the 20 statements that I asked the students about to rank how much they agree on it. And then based on these statements, I gathered information on some of the different advantages and disadvantages of a self-paced classroom from the student's perspective. And so with that in mind, Josh, statements in there that you wanted to particularly point out?
Yeah, so we have, when you started making the questions, you ended up not just making the questions like one direction, like a positive connotation. You also made a negative connotation question as well. So like when you made a question that talked about, I find it difficult to do schoolwork because I have access, or I don't always have access to the internet, there was always a positive version of that question too. What do you feel like was the benefit of kind of asking a question twice in both connotations?
So the reason I did that was mostly just, it sounds pretty basic here, but I mostly just did it so that students who might not take it seriously, who might just go down and circle, bubble in the exact same answer for every single question. It was just kind of a way to try and nullify that. That way, not every time, or if they answered strongly agree to every single question, it won't make it seem like, oh, that student absolutely loves self-paced classrooms or they absolutely hate self-paced classrooms. It was just kind of a way to try and deter that. But yeah, that was something I did. I tried to throw negative connotations on half of the questions and I tried to throw positive connotations on the other half. And the other thing I did was in some of my conversations with the teacher interviews was I kind of picked out specific advantages and disadvantages about these classrooms. So obviously the lack of having internet is a major disadvantage. However, another one such as a question, I find the ability to complete my homework at my own pace in my self-paced classroom to be very helpful. That's obviously a great advantage. So what I also did in these 20 questions was I tried to have 10 of them asking about specific disadvantages and 10 of them asking about specific advantages, and then try and, get the student's perspective on, okay, are these actual disadvantages or is this just something that a teacher might think of, but it really isn't happening to the students, and vice versa.
What was something that really jumped out at you in the data? Like something that you saw that you immediately went like, oh, that's really important and I need to make sure that I talk about that.
I guess the one thing that, and actually you mentioned this to me as well, the idea that there was one question here that asked the students, do you find it difficult to keep track of all your online passwords and things of that nature? And obviously, I got the idea from, or the concept of that from you because, like you said, in your classroom, students have to keep track of an IXL login, a Brain Genie login. You know, I mean, you could sit here and name off a lot of them better than I can. So when I threw that question in there, the other two teachers kind of looked at me kind of like, oh, what is this even asking? Because in our classroom, in the college class, they have one login to my math lab. And in the high school class, I don't even know if they had a login itself. So that was something. What I found interesting about that, though, was the fact that your students, because I was able to, disperse the results based on their teacher, your students actually found that to be less of a disadvantage than the other students. So for whatever reason, your students find it easier to keep track of 5, 6, 7 usernames than a college kid to keep track of one username. I mean, tell me, is there something that you do in your classroom that you find seems to be the reason for that result?
I was really surprised about that too. And there was a couple questions where, just kind of in general, you think about like being in charge of your own learning is something we talk about a lot. Like I'll tell the kids, like, I am here as an aid, like I'm here to help you, but you are responsible for your learning. And I think you see a little bit of that in that password question, because I don't think kids are really reading it about like just keeping track of passwords. I think they're reading it about like, is it my responsibility to know this stuff? And so there's a little bit of that going on too. We also have a couple procedures in my classroom that I hope other teachers who are thinking about doing this really helps with the organizational structure. Like the kid is in charge of making their own calendar every week. The kid is in charge of updating their calendar every day. The kid is in charge of writing a journal about their progress for the week every Friday. The kid is in charge of keeping track of all their usernames and passwords, and if they need one back, they have to get it from me and they have to pay in the classroom currency. Little things like that are, really important. And there's no good way to like emulate that without forcing the kid to be in charge of their learning. And we talk about that every single day. And so I think that's what the question is really getting at.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's why I find it to be is because your classroom isn't simply focused on math. Your classroom is also focused on responsibility and being in charge of your own learning. A good point of emphasis for a middle school classroom because, it's kind of setting up the rest of their future education, as opposed to in the high school and college class where there is no focus on that. It's simply all we're learning here is math. By the way, remember some of these usernames and passwords. Maybe that's why they came up with those results. One more result that I really wanted to point out that I thought was super interesting that we noted a little bit earlier was this statement. It was number 9 said, I feel like I have learned important skills because of my self-paced classrooms, skills such as time management, self-motivation, the ability to ask my teacher, classmates questions, etc. I threw that in there basically to specifically address are these students learning self-regulated learning skills in the classroom? And to no surprise, 93% of your students agreed with that. So, I mean, nearly all of your students thought that, yes, I am learning self-regulated learning skills in this class. As opposed to the other classrooms, it hovered around 70% for the two of them for the high school and college class. So still a large portion of the students felt that, yes, this style of classroom does teach me self-regulated learning skills. I think you kind of just mentioned. Do you find that to be true with your students?
Yeah, and I think the kids actually get really defensive about it. We're at the end of middle school now for some of my 8th graders, and we're having some honest conversations with them about what high school math is going to look like. And rather than just say, because I'll tell them, okay, so you're going to high school, guys, we do need to be ready for, more of a lecture-based environment and more textbook assignments and less choices. We need to be ready for that. And instead of them going, oh, okay, they go, well, why? Why would you teach that way? Why don't we get options? Why don't we get to work at our own speed? And so I've kind of created little monsters in some ways where they are in charge of their learning to the point where, they will challenge the reason why a teacher does it, not to be mean, but because they're genuinely interested. Like, I talk to them every day about why I teach the way that I teach. Why am I giving you less choices on, adding polynomials than I do on factoring? Like, why do we not do a big project with, certain topics but others? And the kids kind of internalize that, and they become very defensive of the classroom mechanics because they want more ownership. They want more responsibility. And I do think something you said too that is really valuable in this conversation is, like, high school, passing the class is the goal. College, passing the class is the goal. Like, it's very much an avenue for something else. Like, middle school, at least in most schools in Maine, like, you're moving on to the next grade level. Like, that's already going to happen. So, like, building skills within the class is a lot more important than just pass or fail, because that's not even really part of our conversation with kids.
Right. I completely agree with that. And, like I said, we could go on. Like I said, we just addressed 2 of the 20 questions. We could sit here and talk about the student survey for hours, but I think we might as well keep this conversation moving on. And so, like I said, I started with talking with teacher interviews. I went on to student surveys. The last thing I did was, based on those results, I kind of created my own mock curriculum, which basically was, I just found a textbook that I like, created a introduction chapter to an Algebra 1 class, and then started introducing those pacing methods. And then I even did go into some choice and leveling methods as well, even though I was mostly focused on pacing. And basically I just did that to, okay, I have the teacher's perspective, I have the student's perspective, I want my own perspective. What would this be like if I ran this in my classroom? And those were essentially the 3 major methods of my research. And then, I guess with that in mind, we can go into the major findings that I came up with based on all this research. And like I said, I was mostly concerned about the advantages and disadvantages of a paced classroom, and I wanted it from the students and the educator's perspective. So I broke that up into those 4 different categories, and I'll just kind of mention the major points within each of those categories. So first thing that for advantages for students was obviously the flexibility and convenience. Every teacher mentioned it, nearly every question pertaining to this, the students found that there was great flexibility and convenience, whether they can move ahead, spend more time on one topic. In a college class, get done with the class early. In your class, get done with a topic and be able to do some games or projects. So that was the biggest advantage that I found for the students. Well, I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Is that certainly something that you've noticed?
I think that's probably the number one benefit. If you compare it to a traditional classroom structure, which is not necessarily very flexible and very rarely is convenient, like on a student's timeline. I think the best example I have is if you are a student who is sick frequently, or you are a student who is out for extracurriculars, a traditional classroom has very few advantages for you to learn the same amount of material as you would have if you were in the room. Whereas a self-paced classroom frequently has lots of ability for you to learn the same material in the same amount of time.
Right, and in a similar note to that, the next biggest thing that I found was that you can help struggling students for that reason. If they're sick and gone for a week, or if they're I know when it comes to track, I was getting to the point where I was only seeing my students in student teaching 2 times a week. And so by having a paced classroom, I was able to spend more one-on-one time with those students. After that, I kind of talked about the advantages for educators, which, again, something very similar, flexibility and convenience. We as teachers, we can, structure the classroom a little bit more fluidly. We can say, okay, if they finish up this stuff early, I can spend more time on review or throw in a project or do games, do something to help make the learning more interactive. However, my absolute favorite thing that I found in this, and this was mentioned by you and Professor Trimble, and I want to get more of your thoughts on it after I mention it, the idea that the teacher gains greater content knowledge. And you're nodding your head. I have a feeling you know where I'm going with this. So tell me a little bit about that. That way it's just not me talking the entire time.
No, I think that I really underestimated how much you need to be an expert on your content in order to create your own structure. So this, if you are just taking someone else's flexible structure and then teaching it, it is not the same as at least having going through the process yourself, which I think is the thing that Will has done brilliantly, and he's probably never going to take enough credit for that. Even like going through a single unit and thinking about, okay, so this type of learner, how would they learn best? What can I make for them? Or this type of learner, how can I make the video a little bit more interactive? Or this type of learner, what could I include here or here? That makes you such a good educator to just have to go through that process, even if it's not every day. And so the other benefit, and Will and I have talked about this before on this podcast, is when you're sitting in class and a kid comes up to you with a question, you have no idea what content they're covering. You know, I had a kid come in today and say, hey, the video's broken on solving quadratics through graphing. And I was like, okay. And they're like, I can't move past it because the video's broken. And you even say on the choice board that you need to fix it. And I'm like, all right, so we're going to sit down for 2.5 minutes and we're going to hammer through the basics of this skill. And I was sitting there being like, I would never have been able to do that 7 years ago. It's just one where you're so used to kids come up to you with anything at any time that you need to be ready to answer those questions constantly.
Right, and that was something I found my student teaching just because my teacher found a good way. Nearly all the students were at about the same point where they should have been starting the semester. Basically, first semester was chapters 1 through 6. Second semester was chapters 7 through 13. So when I came in January, 90% of the students were on chapter 7. So it was real easy just for me to be like, okay, we're working on proportions, setting up proportions, solving equations, solving basically like the shadow project that we talked about last week. And it was, super easy. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I can sit here and teach this area. But then you had some quicker students move on to trigonometric ratios in the next chapter while some are still on ratios. Then they would move on to geometric transformations. And then, the chapter on circles. Suddenly I have 4 chapters of content that I could get hit with a question on any one of those topics. And the students are expecting me to know it off the top of my head, which the first time I'd see it, I'd have to sit there and look at it for a minute. But then, yes, eventually I was able to start snapping out answers like that. I guess with that in mind, the next one was the disadvantages for students. And the biggest one was mostly just technical issues. Students that don't have computer access internet access or computer access at home. So those are real basic things that you can expect all the time. But the big one that I always got questioned about this when I was doing my capstone defense, when I was presenting at some other research committees, this idea of student burnout. And again, this was something that you mentioned to me, and again, I'll throw it to you. Explain to me how, because I think it was explained to be seen more in your classroom than any others. What's this idea of burnout?
So the idea is, if you think about a traditional classroom, students are frequently comparing themselves to each other. They think of learning as a competition. Like you take a test and you immediately ask your classmates, what grade they got, or if the teacher requires a certain grade in order to move on, like you're always compared to that. And no matter what we do as educators, the kids are going to somehow think of it as a competition. It's very age-appropriate behavior. So when you have independent pacing involved, and now you're only competing with yourself, you have this immediate thing of, it's really hard. Like, you're not always feeling like you're winning. And when something goes really poorly, it happens to my kids all the time. Like, well, what do I do? Like this, I went home to do homework and I couldn't do it. And I came back and I'm frustrated. And so you have to have systems in place in order to help those kids from burning out. Some of the things that I do are, we always have activities on Desmos, or games on Manga High, or games on Prodigy, or in-class assignments, or daily quests is what we call them, that they're really small activities we do together. And I just try to build in systems to try to compensate for that burnout, because the truth is, kids who are motivated, you want to keep that motivation going for as long as possible. And if they don't have other avenues in school to really push themselves, they are going to absolutely do everything possible to succeed in your classroom. They're going to do multiple extra assignments all the time. I have kids who are 8th graders who have done 3.5 years worth of content in the last 2 years. and they have done every project I have. They've done every game that I have. They've done every activity that I have, and they've enjoyed it. But we're both kind of ready to move on to the next step. That they really are ready to go to a high school environment. But we fight burnout really on a daily basis.
Yeah, and there's just one student in particular I can think of it during my student teaching. She, around the beginning of January, a fire got lit under her or something. She's like, I want to finish everything as quick as possible in geometry. That way I can move on to Algebra 2 this semester. And she was just flying through, working as hard as she can. It was, I think it was the end of March when she finally finished up the entire year's worth of curriculum. So she finished school pretty much 2 months early, finished math class 2 months early, and we were fully expecting her being ready to go into Algebra 2. And she gave it a week of Algebra 2, and she flat out said, I am exhausted. I am just done with math for this year. And in our classroom, we we're like, all right, yeah, you can go on to a study hall if that's what you'd like. But yes, I think burnout, while it was successful, this classroom was successful for her, she got through everything in a hurry. It just burned her out, and yeah, she was ready to just relax and be done for a little bit.
Yeah, and I think just having smaller incremental goals is something that can really solve that problem, but you don't know that until you've done a pacing environment for longer. You don't know when burnout happens. It's hard because this concept is not necessarily new, but having the technology to supplement it is. And so there's just not a lot of classrooms out there that have done this for very long.
Right. And then, like I said, the last category that we had was the disadvantage for educators. And the biggest one on this was the time and effort that it takes for a teacher to set up this kind of classroom. And obviously, you can speak to this since you've been working with yours for the last 8 years. But me personally, I literally just today on May 9th have started preparing my classroom for next fall. Like I'm not going to be in the classroom for another 3 months, and I've already started recording videos for next fall semester because I know I'm literally going to be spending a good 40 hours a week these next 3 months doing everything I can to get prepped for the classroom. So again, the biggest disadvantage for this type of one is just the time and effort that it takes for a teacher to put in and set up this kind of curriculum.
And if you have any ability to find teachers around you, like working with Will is instrumental in this process, and I'm trying to get him to use some of my stuff. Save yourself some time. If you can find teachers that you trust, that you can use their resources, it will help you immensely in this process. But I believe that good teachers are already putting in this amount of time and effort. Good teachers are already doing this. This is just a system that can maybe help you put that time and effort in and then reuse it more in the future. That all of that work that you already do, this is a system to maybe help you use it again more frequently.
Right. It's a very front-loaded effort where it'll be more efficient in the long run, but it's going to be very front-loaded to begin with. So, yeah. But I guess with that in mind, Josh, did you have one last thing that you wanted to wrap this up with?
I just think that Will should give himself a round of applause for how much effort he put into this. Just this process and this data is so much further along than anything I've seen before. When you pitched this idea to me, and it's been a long time in the past, my immediate reaction was, that sounds awesome, but it sounds like so much work because none of this data is out there right now. You were going from scratch, and I think you did an amazing job.
Yeah, it was. Well, that really wasn't what I was hoping you'd say at the end there, but I guess I'll take it as a comment. But yeah, it was honestly the biggest hoop to jump through wasn't so much as creating the methodology. It was getting permission from the school. I had to create an IRB approval, had to go through committees just to be allowed to interview teachers, and to survey students. So yes, it was quite a long process, but I'd say it was about a year in the making. And yeah, it was something I had a lot of fun doing, and is definitely something I'm obviously going to lean back on in the years to come. But I guess with that in mind, we'd give you a preview for what we're doing next time, but we haven't put any thought into that yet. So I guess next week's topic will be as much of a surprise to us as it is to you. So
Yeah, we'll come and find out what we come up with, I guess.
yeah, that will be. But other than that, Josh, has been fun. I thought this was a great idea, straying away from our normal topic setting and doing something like this. So I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I thought it was great. Hopefully everybody enjoyed it, and we'll try to do this again soon.
That we will again. So hope to have everybody join us next time on the next episode of In Between Classes podcast.